My research, this presentation describes a research in process. You don't have to read this, I do. And when I put something up there for you to see, I'll let you know. Motivated both as a listener and primarily jazz practitioner to involve myself with contemporary performance and composition, I'm looking specifically at the presence and use of improvisation in large, principally symphonic compositions that incorporate elements of the jazz tradition. Or, as I've discovered, vice versa, jazz compositions that incorporate elements of the symphonic tradition. I think it seems that we're in a historic moment in which borrowing and appropriation through the 20th century has resulted in a wealth of possibility for contemporary composers and performers. It seems a good time to review some of what has occurred and see how the essential elements of jazz traditions have been incorporated, how they manifest in the acts of composition and in performance. Research has shown, jazz historical research, that jazz emerged as a result of contributions of musicians from a number of racial, cultural, and social groups. Though this is true, the source of its sound and improvisational character is recognized as firmly based in Afro-American performance practice. Almost since its emergence in the early part of the 20th century, the late 10s and then the 20s, a number of composers of symphonic works have mined elements of its language as source material: melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, textural. Examples include Darius Milhaud's Creation of the World, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, Aaron Copland's Piano Concerto, and William Grant Still, an Afro-American composer, his Afro-American Symphony. In fact, in 1930, William Grant Stills held an optimistic belief in the viability of a Negro symphony orchestra. And it was based on his own experience as both composer and performer in classical, jazz, and popular idioms. Imagining the players in such an orchestra, Still predicted that their training in the jazz world would even have enhanced their virtuosity, and that they would be able to play perfectly passages that would be difficult for a man trained only in the usual academic way. This is in 1930. Composer and performer Gunther Schuller called this a cross-fertilization, describing the process and results of composers investigating the possibilities and implications of bringing together concepts, approaches, language, and conventions of numerous traditions. But he added a caveat. All were captivated by the new fascinations of jazz, the sound of the saxophone, the sound of the clarinet in Rhapsody in Blue, although in a very few instances did they really understand and appreciate the true improvisatory nature of jazz. It is this improvisatory nature which interests me, which I've experienced on stage in the give and take, the spontaneity, the intensity of jazz performance. What intrigues me in this instance is if and how it is possible to expand that nature and experience to include the participation of the much larger symphonic formation. Throughout the 30s and 40s, there were some experiments, numerous experiments of jazz, both jazz composers and classical composers. Some of these attempts by composers of the still separate classical and jazz lines to incorporate appropriate experiment with the possibilities of combination. The results often cause substantial resistance amongst performers and, of course, critics, often taking the form of almost a defense of the territory, worried that the purity of the respective traditions was being sullied. It was not until the late 1950s that Gunther Schuller proposed a third stream that he thought by establishing this, that the two, in quotes, he states, the two other main streams could go their way unaffected by attempts at fusion. So sort of taking the argument and placing it on the side, allowing another stream to occur and if arguments were necessary, they could occur on the other two, from the other two fields. In works of this emergent phase of his third stream, one finds gestures and timbres identified with jazz coexisting and in interaction with contemporary 20th century classical language. Most pertinent to my present investigation is the question of improvisation's place in this new soundscape, how it is prioritized by the composer, how it is elicited, and its purpose in moving a work forward. In recent years, increasing focus has been placed on the act and process of improvisation, resulting in an expansion of its use from the jazz soloist accompanying orchestra format, simply a soloist in front of an orchestra. George Lewis, in his notes in a series that the American Composers Orchestra did about 10 years ago called Improvise Now, he noted that these have included the work of Henry Threadgill, V.J. Iger, George Lewis himself. I'll go back to George Lewis's work in a bit here, because he raises a very, very crucial point about the place that jazz improvisation comes from. I'll focus today on the work of Gunther Schuller, composer and instigator of this movement, the third stream, Butch Morris, who has developed a process he terms and trademarked conduction, the musings, the talk of George Lewis, and my own process of composing a work which includes a number of formats and areas for improvisation. My interest and current focus is on observing and describing the act of improvisation and the multiple processes involved as it emerges in time. And as I conclude later, I'll propose a number of potential frames through which to consider this subject. As I've proceeded to parse it, I've realized that either I underestimated its scope or that it grows ever larger as one attempts to define, describe, and comprehend it. It reminds me that the act of performance perhaps remains the most effective means of conversing about music. But since we're here to talk, I'll go off. Following sociologist Leon Anderson's lead in defining and limiting analytic autoethnography, I place myself in the field of composers and improvisers who are working with these issues, and thus feel free, taking the prescribed precautions, to discuss my own attempts at including improvisation in a symphonic formation, and the questions, realizations, and observations which arise both during and after the creation of a work and its performance. In his Poetics of the Open Work, Umberto Eco stated that a number of recent pieces of instrumental music are linked by a common feature, the considerable autonomy left to the individual performer in the way he chooses to play a work. And he cites pieces by Stockhausen and Berio and Boulez. What he doesn't state is any work by John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, symphonic composer of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music, which was an association which started in Chicago. I think virtually all the members were Afro-American, looking for an alternative space for their own work. They were composers and performers that came from the jazz tradition, but were looking to move beyond the straight-ahead world, and had very little space for that. There was very little critical space or public space for them to perform, so they created their own association and simply started performing in small spaces, and grew into a very important movement in the jazz tradition. These include people like Muhal Richard Abrams, Henry Threadgill, Leroy Jenkins, the 1950s and the decades on, as really a time in which two separate lines of improvisation formed and developed, and that most of the critical information, the research, the publications were focused on the open forms and the improvisational chance work of, represented by John Cage. These also included composers like Earl Brown. What he was bringing to the fore was that actually improvisation as an open form had existed in the Afrological line well before that, and that it was being placed to the side. I won't go into that area here, but it is an important subject when it comes to the meaning of improvisation, as we spoke about, because improvisation informed by the Afro-American tradition has a lot to do with signifying, with black artists using phraseology and references to their culture. And so, and that was very dependent as well on an audience understanding that. That's a whole other subject which has to do with extra musical meaning, which we won't go into here. Lewis identified two lines of approach to improvisation, two musical belief systems and behavior that exemplified particular kinds of musical logic. He uses these terms to historicize the particularity of perspective characteristic of two systems that have evolved in divergent cultural environments. He also states that they make no attempt to delineate ethnicity or race. They're designed to ensure that the reality of the ethnic or racial component of a historically emergent socio-musical group must be faced squarely and honestly. So he wasn't saying that you had to be African American to play that way. It was a matter of approach and training and the tradition from which one comes. Christopher Small observed that African improvisers respond not only to the inner necessities of the sound world, but also to the dynamics of the human situation. I find this a very nice way to frame what happens in improvisation. And this is very crucial. It offers a very different set of signifiers and rhetorical devices when it comes from that tradition. Derek Bailey, in 1992, I believe, published a book called Improvisation, in which he looks at improvisation from many different traditions, including the organ tradition, jazz, rock, free, Indian raga, etc., and tried to, in one small book, investigate what improvisers talked about, how they expressed themselves and how they experienced improvisation. He said in that book that a lot of improvisers find improvisation worthwhile, I think, because of the possibilities, things that can happen but rarely do. One of these things is that you're taken out of yourself. Something happens which so disorients you that for a time, which might only last a second or two, your reactions and responses are not what they normally would be. You can do something you didn't realize you were capable of, or you don't appear to be fully responsible for what you're doing. Two examples of this might be the production of some member of the group of something so apt or inappropriate that it momentarily overwhelms your sensibility, and the results of this type of thing are literally incalculable. Well, today perhaps we're living in a moment in which it has become possible to calculate, to some extent, the results. Certainly new tools have been developed to observe and even measure and define the process of improvisation. These come from fields as diverse as neurology, neurobiology, sociology, ethnomusicology. Improvisation is being looked at in itself as a very important act. There's an important paragraph I want to read before I go on to the samples. Keith Sawyer was writing in Improvisational Cultures, Collaborative Emergence, Creativity and Improvisation. And he says that jazz is fundamentally an ensemble art form, and everyone involved in the improvisation is constantly offering new ideas, tentative moves, slight variations, and each musician is listening closely to the others. The performance that results is truly a group creation, a collective social process that he calls, collaborative emergence. I asked myself how I was going to define jazz and how I was going to define improvisation. There are two words that would take a long time to define, and I prefer here to read something that Butch Morris said about what jazz is to him. Butch Morris is one of the composers we'll hear today, who's writing in the contemporary time. And he's talking about what the essence of jazz is, because I think when we start to use it in a symphonic world, we're not necessarily looking for the exact phraseology or things that have been heretofore considered jazz. He says, even today, I don't truly have the answer of what jazz is, but I know that spontaneity, momentum, combustion, all these things are used in jazz. That's actually the essence of swing to me. And I realized early on that I didn't want bands that necessarily were swinging in the traditional sense. What I really wanted was the essence of swing. I'm going to play 4 works. 2 of them are by Gunther Schuller, written at the time that the third stream emerged, and that he created festivals and groups to play some of his work and other works. One is called Variants for jazz quartet and orchestra. One is called Concertino for the same ensemble. One of them is Butch Morris's work called Relative C, and another is a work that I'm working on called Interventions. This is the beginning of one of the variants. Play another excerpt here. An interesting point here is that Schuller is using something that Andre O'Dare called simulated improvisation. This piece was written as a commission for George Balanchine's dance company, and Balanchine did not want to deal with the possibility of things going haywire with improvisation. So he asked Schuller to write out the improvisations, and that's what this is. So we have something that sounds like improvisation. This was a device used also by Duke Ellington in some of his suites, where the listener believes or might believe that it's improvised, but in fact, so he's using this component of jazz tradition, but it's written in this case. Let me move it forward here. Of course, the strings and the orchestral parts are all written. Okay, so there are 7 movements to this piece, and they varied a theme or a set of chord changes, and texturally they change. And again, everything in this case is written. However, in concertino, he actually allows the quartet to improvise while writing for the symphony orchestra. That's a different way of going about this. And again, this is all around the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. Again, jazz is this. Da-ding, ding, da-ding, ding, da-ding. So it's a very limited view, in fact, of what jazz is. But it's a signifier. That bass and that drummer is saying jazz, signifying jazz. The vibraphone and piano are now improvisers. And here he's also using the sound of jazz big band of that time period. Again, using the orchestra, horns, to elicit something that signifies jazz. It's not improvised. It's using the textures and it's using the expression. Okay, so that's the format of jazz soloist or soloists backed by a symphonic formation, written with written parts. Speaking about improvisation, you have the improvisers, the soloists themselves, perhaps responding to what's going on, responding to each other, certainly responding to the bass and drum, to the momentum, etc. But you don't really have the orchestra responding. You have the orchestra responding to the conductor or the drummer. I'm going to fast forward in time because I'm not. Rather than do a history, linear history, I'd like to talk about things that have happened and things that are going on now. I would say probably in the past 20 years or so, composers have begun to look to see if this heat and combustion and improvisatory nature of jazz can be extended into a large 50 to 80 piece orchestra, which of course could end up in chaos. It's not, and that would not be the idea. So I'm going to fast forward to some of the work of Butch Morris, who's come up with a very interesting approach. He doesn't write anything out. There's no notation. What there is a set of signals He's termed his approach conduction, and he is a conductor. He's a focal point of this performance. It's not a free group performance without any leader. But the rehearsal process has to do with learning a set of signals that he presents to the performers. He says this, that these signs and gestures, each instrumentalist, each individual instrumentalist should consider and think of all the following directives, which I'll show in a minute, as visual analog representations of musical sound that are qualitatively defined as content in his system. So the performer provides, or the performers provide the content, and he provides what he calls the structure, the signals and the way the signals occur in time. I've interviewed him about this, and he's very clear that he does not know what's going to happen as far as content. So what's happening in the moment with both small and large ensembles is something very much in the moment. Each directive, he says, is a cell of information whose significance is defined only when the interpreter gives it meaning. So a sustain or a ritardando or a repeat is given meaning by a performer and then continued and then directed. And all signs and gestures are interrogative inasmuch that they each ask of the instrumentalist, what does this sound like in this situation at this time to you? And what is the content you choose to put here in this context? The signs are in three general categories. Who is going to do something, and there he can point to individuals, he can point to groups, he can create groups at the time. So it's not necessarily all the strings or all the woodwinds playing together. It can be groups that he creates on the spot. And then what are they going to do, and when? Simple musical components that we deal with all the time. These are some of the directives. Now we can go to this, I think. Good. You have sustains, repeats, dynamics, pitch and tonality directives, time, tempo, pulse, rhythm, the way of modifying tempos, double time, half time. So if he hears an idea that he feels he wants to develop, he may give a double time or half time signal to that performer and have them do the same thing in double or half time, etc. Transforming a fragment, deconstructing it, taking a fragment and doing something else with it, using the same motif, etc. Punctuation, accents, articulations, all these things, again, that are essential musical elements and broken down to a set of signs. The practical truth is that not every symphonic orchestra contains people who are used to improvisation, and at this historical moment, he has experienced oftentimes going into an orchestra and having people really not know what is going to happen and how to do this. So there is a process of what he says, taking their music stands away and telling them that we're going to make a piece of music, which apparently creates an enormous amount of fear in the performers and resistance, which is natural. Let's hear a little bit of his pieces. Again, here we are in really in-time improvisation. think it's interesting to pay attention to the background rhytm, bump, bop, because about 15 minutes later it comes back. Not written, but by memory. So I found that interesting. A little bit further there. Here you have something that sounds like interaction between soloist and accompanying parts. So you have some solo voices, trumpet, cello. And then hear the end that I was speaking about. That's the end of his piece. 27 minutes of improvisation without notation. The third piece that I'll speak about is mine. And again, I do this with care and a little bit of concern that I'm inserting myself into this history, but the subject arises because I do it. And the subject arises because I face some questions as a composer and improviser. Especially in this piece, which is a piece for symphonic jazz orchestra. The piece is called Interventions, and it contains a number of elements of things I think we've spoken about today. It has some extra musical meaning. It's based on motives. It gives improvisers a place, certain spots to improvise, and its structure contains interludes in between movements where the pianist can sort of comment on things that have gone on in the previous movement, or even foreshadow, if he knows the piece, what's going to happen. As well as that, I give the conductor a set of wild cards, which are interventions, very short interventions, that are designed to be placed at moments when the conductor feels it interesting or necessary to jog an improviser, perhaps out of something he's doing by habit, or just to alter the course of the piece. What my intention is that those short interventions can change so that the piece is never really finished, which I think is part of the essence of improvisation, perhaps, that things become new and that new stimuli are provided. And in the symphonic orchestra, since these stimuli can't, well, maybe not can't, but perhaps if they were being provided, if every performer, individual in an 80-piece orchestra, were given the freedom to interject at any point, it could get chaotic. But if a conductor has, again, this wild card, perhaps that can represent that kind of communication and interaction that a jazz performance contains. So I'm going to play a few, unfortunately, MIDI-generated examples because it hasn't been performed yet, but let's see where we are. First of all, it is based on a few motives. I left out an important part here. One of the issues I was dealing with as I wrote, and for some reason when I was writing a half-an-hour piece, I wanted it to be about something. And a very personal moment in my life was occurring in which my mother was losing her memory and my son was gaining his memory. It was a perfect moment when I was able to see two parts of a spectrum that occurs in our lives when sort of the arc of learning and developing, and then the other side of that where sometimes people begin to lose that process. And I wanted to reflect that. And in the course of the piece, certain motives represent that and certain events represent that. So here's one motive. I guess I'll play it. And motive B. Which are usually horns. And then an extension of motive B. And then another motive C. So, the point of that is that the improviser has that improvisation in hand, that information in hand. And he's able to, part of the directive is that you can refer to the motives of the piece in the improvisation. So he enters the stage, or he enters the movement with those motives learned, and he has the freedom to transform them as in any improvisation based on themes. I'll give you one example of the piece with an intervention. This is intervention. Here we go. I'll play a little section, a passage here, which ends up at the first moment of improvisation. It's electric guitar. And then you have piano and guitar setting the stage for a new open, free section of improvisation. And then it's free improvisation for a couple of improvisers. My idea being that the motives and the themes and what's just occurred and all that intensity and momentum feed the performer. He has now the choice of playing, quote unquote, free. There's no background in this first one. There's no time happening. There's no drum going ding, 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 ding. It's free. However, my point, which I do make clear to the performers, is that we're talking about how memory develops. And what I'd like to happen as a composer is that these motives, which can become, which are, I'm using to represent incipient ideas, the initiation of thought, become more complex. And hopefully that starts to happen. But if it doesn't start to happen, then the interventions come in. And in this particular occasion, I have a couple of interventions just to show what I have in mind. So imagine this is all happening, and now the guitarist is improvising, or the saxophonist. And now the composer comes with his wild card and points and says 1A or 1B to the group of musicians, instrumentalists that have this intervention. And that would be something like this in this case. The idea being that an idea in the world, we don't walk around with ideas all isolated by ourselves, especially when we're communicating with a symphony orchestra. So other things will happen. And the idea is now, what will the improviser do? How will that alter his thought process? Will he ignore it? Will he use it? Will he respond to it in some kind of way that an improviser really does in the course of a jazz performance? And that's what makes me curious here. What happens in the act of performance and in the act of improvisation? And how is it, what's the process, how fast does it go, and how can it be altered? And when it's altered, what does that mean? The other one in that case would be this one, and then I'll conclude. And again, my hope is, in performance and in the course of performance, if there were multiple performances, that these interventions could be rewritten so that it never becomes habitual. Okay, so there are 3 or 4 moments in the piece where an improvisation section is open, and there are a number of interventions written that the conductor can choose from and insert at any time. So we've listened to Schuller, who started out sounding like he was adding improvisation. It was basically a tool to make things sound as if things were improvised. Then a background orchestra as a background and providing written material that was background for a solo. You heard Butch Morris, who has done away with notation altogether and just works with signs. And then you've heard this piece, which attempts to sort of straddle the line. There are many written parts, and there are opportunities for this type of occurrence of the transference and the communication between groups and between people in the orchestra, and of course the conductor in this case. And it brings me, as well as working from my side as composer, as I research this and look into what's going on in this moment, I've found that there are a number of fields, as I said before, that this might be looked at. And I'm hoping that in improvisation studies we begin to bring these things together and perhaps apply them to what goes on as we perform. I've mentioned collective creativity of Keith Sawyer. There's a field of study that has to do with swarm theory, which I'm finding very interesting, which has to do with collective improvisation. And the people who are proposing this have used as an example the way that ants work together, in that it seems very chaotic, but in fact it's extremely organized. But there's no one leader. It has to do with things that have to occur and things that do occur, and leaving traces chemically of things that have been done so that other people can follow. And there's a theory here that collective jazz improvisation or open improvisation might be measured in this way. There's another field which is called entrainment, which has to do with the fact that two independent bodies oscillating at different frequencies, if they're brought close enough together for long enough time, they start to oscillate together. And this is now being applied to human interaction and how people respond to and with each other. This to me has a great deal to do with time feel. Because as an improviser, that's one of the crucial things in playing with somebody, is how you're feeling time internally. Because you can play all the right notes together, but if the time feel isn't correct, it's, as we say, not happening. And it's an interesting thing that I've experienced going cross-culturally between the States and Brazil, because we play the same notes and the same harmony, and what's on the page looks exactly the same to us, except we feel it differently because of our traditions and rhythmical, what we've lived rhythmically. And in order to play together and improvise together to go to the next step requires an enormous amount of empathy, which I think is part of this idea of improvising. And in the neurobiological area, an ethnomusicologist who's also a physician from Harvard started to really look at what spontaneity was and improvisation was, without going into the details of his experiment. What he found that things were going on in the mind that had to do with three areas. And it was an overlap that he found between melodic improvisation and rhythmic improvisation in three areas of the brain. One, which takes information about where the body is in space and makes a motor plan, and then sends it to the motor cortex to execute the plan. This happening very quickly, of course. It's a motor activity. And then there's one that has to deal with conflict monitoring. So when you're trying to sort out conflicting possibilities involved with decision making, which I relate very much to, again, a jazz ensemble. When you're not doing this alone, there are conflicting signals that you deal with. Each musician is sending out a signal, and you have to work with that in order to make something happen in time that's a coherent musical statement. And the other part is the one known to be involved when people speak and understand language. And so improvising, from a neurobiological perspective, involves generating, selecting, and executing musical motor sequences. And something that wouldn't surprise musicians, but in terms of brain research, it's apparently something relatively new. So where does this point to in the future? I think we're at a moment, as I said, when it's not enough just to say we do it, we just play. I think it's something that if we begin to understand, appreciate, and appreciate all the things that go into it, we expand the possibilities and we become less, let's call it, prisoner of tradition and prisoner of what's happened before, because we begin to understand and open up other possibilities. I think we have come to a point where maybe we can measure what's going on in improvisation. And with composers and performers having mined the jazz tradition for effects and phraseology and a sense of swing and borrowed structures like the blues in Rhapsody in Blue, we've come to this moment when the orchestra might be capable of adopting this essential part of the jazz ethic, which might be summed up by the phrase, "Let's play." Now, since the time of Ornette Coleman and free jazz and Don Cherry, that has included the possibility of playing free, without preconceived form or content. People who played with them, two in particular, a bass player, Charlie Hayden, and the saxophone player, Steve Lacy, both tell stories that illustrate the challenge of that invitation, the hours of playing together that were necessary to achieve satisfying results, and the pleasure taken in the sense of liberation and shared musical experience. The complication, of course, is to realize that essence in a large formation, where individual decisions are often and perhaps best mediated by a controlling or guiding factor, which can be a conductor. Thank you.
So I was expecting that you wouldn't feel that need, because the process of improvisation, you talked earlier, Butch Morris, was so far away from that need of signifying. May I ask why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have two answers. First, the piece has 5 movements plus interludes, so it's a long, expansive work that includes this reference. And the second thing is, I'm probably writing out my past, in a way, which, although intellectually I can say it's not necessary, for some reason I always go back to it. And I think that's part of the composition and process of evolving. And maybe my next piece won't need it.
Just one more question. How do you choose your soloists for your piece? From the people from the symphonic orchestra or jazz soloists?
Good question. In this case, this is written for symphonic jazz orchestra. So there will be people who are comfortable with improvising and probably have worked on it for some time. However, the free sections, where there's no real need to refer to a tradition, I have a violin soloing at one point. It doesn't have to be the jazz soloist. Yeah. Thank you very much. Sure, thank you.
Yes, I was curious, Cliff, again, about the improvising sections. So besides the violin, for instance, did you also ask for instrumentalists of the orchestra to improvise, or they have only the cards which are written?
Again, depends on the movement. There's a movement mainly for percussion where the percussionists are asked to improvise. To improvise. So again, it's not only the jazz soloists, hopefully.
And something also that I perceived, in the Norris piece, is that the orchestra was really trying to improvise in the way they understand as an improvisation in a classical oriented way. And also on the other hand, the excerpt that you played, the pianist trying to respond, whatever we can call as classical or jazz language, it was, it was almost like he was trying to adapt to this kind of language. I perceived it this way. I don't know if you agree. I mean, in the excerpt that you played from Bernard's piece, which I think just the challenge of having 27 minutes not written at all, I think it's great. You know, but I don't know if you you perceived this. I mean, I felt that the orchestra members were trying to improvise in a kind of vocabulary, although a little bit limited, you know, in terms of what they understood as a classical kind of improvisation. Whereas the jazz, I mean, the pianist was a jazz musician, or do you know about that?
No, I don't believe so. I think they were all classically trained Hochschule musicians from Switzerland.
So there wasn't any kind of jazz intent in this improvisation.
Well, no, that's where I wouldn't say. There was no history of jazz improvisation from the performers, but the intent, I think, again, according to Butch Morris, his intent is just essentially jazzistic. So what he tries to elicit from any ensemble that he's in front of, and that's included vocalists from Italy and traditional Korean instruments, etc., is this immediacy and spontaneity of communication between them.
Sorry, just one more question. Okay. I was wondering, there is a great book, I think, from Lee Konitz called The Art of Improvisation. It's some kind of biography of Lee Konitz. He speaks about the true improvisers and the other improvisers. Of course, he himself includes himself in the true improvisers and a very few, Keith Jarrett and Ornette Coleman. Any comment about this true improviser concept or the other kind of improvisers that, we know that improvisation, if it occurs 10% in one night, somebody said that 10% of improvisation in one night, that's great.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. So any comment about that?
First, I haven't read the book, and I will. And I'm not sure if he's referring to idiomatic improvisation at that point.
I don't think so.
No. So I'd have to read it. I can surmise, but I shouldn't answer it until I read it.
Okay, thank you very much.
For the first, this aesthetics of improvisation, certainly it is appreciated just because of spontaneity and immediacy and novelty, that it brings something real new. But on the other hand, there is this linguistic analogy, so that we are improvising from a certain grammar which we have first adapted in our brain, and then from this we can, like Saussure had, we had langue parole, so we have the grammar and speech is produced. But then this orchestral issue is interesting because now you say that there are orchestras which can improvise, but you know, it was a big victory in the history of orchestra playing that they don't improvise, because in Italy, for instance, we have the descriptions by Berlioz and Mendelssohn from the 19th century, when the musicians were improvising. They didn't play exactly what was written in the notes, but everyone was improvising their own. It was terrible because it was cacophonic, and then only later this bad habit was learned out. But now in this jazz style, you said that we get again back to this orchestra which is improvising. And then it's creating something really new. So it's interesting fluctuating of the history.
I think in the 20th century, the jazz composers who were looking to enter this field were presented with orchestras that did not improvise, because it was 20th century and that training had apparently been erased.
Yes.
And so that was a challenge. That was the challenge.
Yeah, the question of a gentleman about whether it would be classical or jazz musicians in the orchestra. I mean, I think it's great because, I mean, perhaps with jazz musicians in the orchestra, I mean, of course, the result would be something.
Yeah, I think Butch Morris works with the same guys all the time back in the US.
He has an ensemble, but...
He has an ensemble, right?
Yeah, but for instance, this is an orchestra with whom he's worked, I think, 3 times. Yeah, so he does have an orchestra that changes personnel.
Is this the same process as Richard Abrams' orchestra? I think a similar process of acting?
Well, Mulehall, as far as I know,
I think they have papers, sheet music.
with Mulehall's pieces, some of them do. I'm not sure. Again, I don't know the full body of his work, but certainly Butch has made it a point not to write things out. Yeah.
I'm afraid we have to finish our first section.